My name is Christopher Coons. I am 33 years old and a Sergeant First Class in the Army Rangers. For over a decade, I believed only in the strength of my own hands and the steel of my weapon. I was not a religious man. I was a soldier who relied on logic and training, drifting far from the faith of my childhood to focus on being the most effective warrior I could be. On April 2nd, 2026, my life as I knew it ended during a night training maneuver at Fort Hunter Liggett. Our tactical vehicle hit a hidden ravine at high speed, flipping 3 times before the fuel system ignited. I was pinned in the wreckage, the heat searing my skin and the smoke filling my lungs. My heart stopped beating and my breath ceased. The medical report later confirmed I was dead for 14 minutes. While the medics worked to pull my charred body from the steel, I was no longer on that field in California. I was suddenly standing in a place of immense living light. It was a farm, but it felt like the heartbeat of the world. The soil was dark and fertile beyond anything on earth, and the crops were massive, heavy with golden grain that swayed in a breeze I could feel against my face. But a heavy dread hung over the beauty. At the edges of the fields, I saw 4 giant bulls as tall as houses. 3 of them were painted with the colors of foreign powers: red, gold, and deep green. They began to tear into the crops with a greedy, violent hunger, stomping the harvest into the mud. Then I saw the 4th bull, painted with the stars and stripes of the United States. It was the largest of all, but it was not fighting back. It began to shudder from within, its legs buckling until it crashed into the dirt, dead from its own internal rot. The other bulls immediately moved in to trample its remains. That was the moment I turned and saw him. I saw Jesus standing in the light, and I fell to my face because my legs simply would not hold me. It wasn't like seeing a person. It was like being in the presence of everything that is true and pure. I felt an overwhelming wave of love that made me weep for every moment I had ignored him, but I also felt his profound sadness. His eyes were like fire, yet they held a kindness that broke me. He reached out and touched my shoulder, and his thoughts entered my mind as clearly as if he were shouting. He told me that he was showing me these things because the time of the harvest was here, and I was being sent back as a messenger to warn those who would listen. He pulled me upward, and we were standing high above the world, looking down at the landscape of the country I had sworn to protect. He didn't just show me images, he made me feel the very ground beneath the people. He turned my gaze toward Denver. As I looked, I didn't just see the buildings, I heard the mountains themselves. There was a sound coming from the deep earth, a low, grinding roar that vibrated through my soul. The great peaks of the Rockies, which have always seemed like the very definition of permanent strength, began to shudder. I saw massive slabs of rock, miles wide, beginning to slide. In the city below, the people were going about their mornings. I saw a woman sitting in a coffee shop, laughing with a friend. I saw a man in a business suit walking toward a bus stop. Then the first pulse hit. It wasn't a normal earthquake. It was a rhythmic strike, like a hammer hitting the underside of the world. With each strike, the ground became less like soil and more like water. The high-rise buildings in the center of Denver didn't just fall. They began to tilt and sink. I watched as a glass tower snapped in half, the top portion sliding down into the street like a child's toy. The pavement opened up into jagged maws that swallowed cars and people whole. Then, the mountains groaned one last time, and a massive landslide, a wall of earth and stone, came rushing down toward the outskirts of the city. A great cloud of gray dust rose up, so thick that it blotted out the sun, and a sudden, unnatural cold swept through the air. Jesus showed me that the survivors would be wandering in a world of gray ash, unable to find the roads they once knew. He told me that this was the beginning of the shaking, and it would start before the month of April was over. He then shifted my vision to the northeast, toward Boston. I saw the harbor, and for a moment, it looked peaceful. But then the horizon line of the ocean began to change. It didn't look like a wave, it looked like the entire level of the Atlantic was being tilted toward the land. A dark, oily surge of water began to push into the streets. It wasn't fast at first, but it was unstoppable. I saw the water move into the historic neighborhoods swirling around the brick buildings. But as the water rose, the sky above turned a strange, bruised purple. A storm began to brew that defied everything I knew about weather. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in a matter of minutes. The salt water flooding the streets began to turn into a thick, slushy ice. I saw people who had climbed to their second floors or onto their roofs to escape the flood, only to realize they were now trapped in a freezing tomb. The ice locked the doors shut. The wind began to howl with a sound like a wounded animal tearing the shingles off the roofs. Jesus showed me that the very elements would turn against each other, and those who thought they were safe because they lived on a hill would find themselves isolated and freezing with no way for help to reach them through the frozen sea that the streets had become. He then pointed toward the south to New Orleans. I saw the levees, those massive walls of concrete and earth that the city relies on. I saw them not just breaking, but dissolving. It was as if the very atoms of the concrete were being pulled apart by the pressure of the water. The Gulf of Mexico didn't just overflow, it claimed the land. I watched as the water rushed through the French Quarter, carrying away everything in its path. The soil beneath the city, which had been sinking for a long time, finally gave way completely. It was like a giant hand pushed the city down into the mud. I saw the rooftops disappear beneath the brown, swirling water. There was no screaming after the first few minutes. There was only the sound of the rushing tide. The map of the southern coast was being redrawn right before my eyes. The water reached so far inland that it created new bays where forests used to be. Jesus let me feel the loss of that city, the history and the lives washed away, because the foundations were built on sand and vanity. From the flooded south, we moved west to Phoenix. Here, the vision was dominated by a blinding white light. The heat wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical force. I saw the air shimmering and warping above the desert. The thermometer readings were climbing past anything recorded in human history. I saw the power grid of the city under a strain that was impossible to meet. Then I saw the transformers begin to explode. One by one, the lights of the city went out. The air conditioning units hummed and then died. In that moment, the city became a furnace. I saw millions of people realize at once that their homes were no longer safe. They poured out into the streets, trying to get to their cars, but the heat was so intense that the asphalt was sticking to their shoes. The engines of the cars began to overheat and stall, blocking the highways. I saw mothers trying to shade their children with their own bodies, but there was no shade to be found. The sun was a relentless enemy. Jesus showed me that without the cooling systems of man, the desert would reclaim its territory in days. The silence that fell over the city as the people succumbed to the heat was the most haunting thing I've ever experienced. He then turned my eyes to the center of the country, to St. Louis. The disaster here was different. I saw the arch standing over the river, but the river was not flowing correctly. It was thick with debris and slowed to a crawl. But the real horror was in the streets. I saw a massive crowd of people gathered outside a grocery store. The doors were locked and barred. The people were not just angry, they were transformed by a primal fear. I saw a man who looked like a normal father, someone I might have served with, holding a heavy pipe. He was fighting another man for a small bag of flour. There was no compassion left. I saw the thin veil of what we call civilization being torn away. With the power out and the food trucks no longer arriving from the devastated coasts, the city had turned into a hunting ground. I saw the police stations abandoned, the officers having gone home to protect their own families. I saw fires starting in the suburbs, and no one came to put them out. The smoke from the burning houses mixed with the humid air, creating a choking haze. Jesus showed me that when the belly is empty and the future is dark, the heart of man without God becomes a terrifying thing. Finally, in this first part of the journey, he showed me Philadelphia. The city of brotherly love was in ruins. I saw the old stone buildings, the places where the nation was born, developing deep, jagged cracks. The ground beneath the city had turned into a gray, liquid mush. It was a process called liquefaction, where the solid earth acts like a stormy sea. The streets were buckling, throwing cars into the air. The subway tunnels beneath the city were collapsing, trapping thousands in the dark. I saw the water mains bursting, but instead of providing water to drink, they were flooding the foundations of the buildings, making them collapse even faster. The city was being isolated. The bridges over the rivers had twisted and fallen into the water, leaving the survivors trapped on a crumbling island of concrete. I saw the darkness descend on the city, a darkness that felt heavy, as if it were a physical blanket. There were no lights, no sirens, just the sound of the earth shifting and the distant cries of people who realized that the world they knew had ended. Jesus stood with me in the midst of these visions, and his presence was the only thing that kept me from losing my mind. Every time I thought I couldn't look anymore, I felt his hand on my shoulder, giving me the strength to bear witness. He told me that these things were not just possibilities. They were the consequences of a world that had forgotten its maker. He showed me that the pride of man, which built these great cities and trusted in its own cleverness, was being brought low. I saw the fear in the eyes of the powerful and the wealthy as their money became just paper and their status became a target. But in the midst of all this destruction, I also saw small flickers of light. Individuals who were praying, who were sharing what little they had, who were looking up toward the sky even as the ground fell away. Jesus looked at those small lights with a love that was so intense it felt like it could restart my dead heart. He led me further through the sky, and the map of the country beneath us seemed to pulse with a sickly light. Jesus turned my attention toward the north, to the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I saw the great Mississippi River, the same river that had been torn apart further south, but here it was behaving differently. The water was turning a deep, rusted red, and it began to churn as if it were boiling. I saw the massive bridges that connected the two cities. I saw a line of commuters, thousands of cars bumper to bumper trying to get across as the first tremors began. It wasn't a sudden collapse like Denver. It was a slow, agonizing groan of metal. I watched as the bolts popped off the steel beams like bullets. The bridges didn't just fall. They twisted into knots, dropping thousands of people into the boiling red water below. The current was so strong that it pulled the wreckage under in seconds. I saw the flour mills and the old buildings along the riverfront simply slide into the water as the banks dissolved. The grain that was stored there, meant to feed the hungry, was washed away and lost. Jesus showed me that even the heart of the north would find no safety in its distance from the oceans. Then we moved toward the southeast, hovering over Atlanta. The heat here was a heavy, wet blanket that seemed to choke the very air. I saw the massive interstates, the ribbons of concrete that usually carry the lifeblood of the region, turned into a maze of fire. Because the power grid had failed across the entire region, the traffic lights were dark and the logic of the road was gone. I saw hundreds of accidents, cars piled on top of each other for miles. People were abandoning their vehicles and trying to walk, but the humidity and the heat were so intense that they were collapsing on the hot pavement. I saw the tall buildings of downtown Atlanta glowing orange, not from the sun, but from fires that had started in the lower levels. There was no water pressure to fight them. The hydrants were dry. I watched as the fire leaped from one building to the next, fueled by the debris in the streets. I saw people in the suburbs huddling in their basements, praying for a breath of cool air that would never come. Jesus showed me that the pride of the city, its growth and its busy commerce, was its own undoing. When the wheels stopped turning, the city became a trap of concrete and flame. He then pulled me toward Nashville. I saw the Cumberland River rising with a speed that was terrifying. It wasn't just rain that caused it. It was as if the earth itself was squeezing the water out of the ground. I saw the streets of the city, places of music and joy, suddenly silenced. The water rushed into the basements of the theaters and the homes, destroying everything. I saw a man standing on his roof, holding a guitar, looking at the water with eyes full of a hollow, broken light. He wasn't crying, he was just gone inside. Jesus let me feel the spiritual drought that had preceded the physical flood. The music that had once been used to praise God had turned into a song of self and money, and now the silence was the only thing left. I saw the churches in the area, some of them grand and beautiful, standing empty as the water rose through their pews. The people hadn't run to the altars. They had run to their bank accounts, and now those accounts were just numbers on a dead screen. From the hills of Tennessee, we flew toward the Pacific, looking down at San Diego. I saw the great naval ships, the ones I had spent my life respecting, sitting in the harbor. But the ocean was withdrawing. The water was pulling away from the shore, exposing the dark, slimy floor of the sea that no one was ever meant to see. I saw the sailors on the decks of those massive carriers looking out at the horizon with binoculars, their faces pale with a fear that training could not erase. Then I saw it. A line on the horizon that looked like a mountain range moving toward them. It was a wall of water so high it blotted out the clouds. When it hit the coast, it didn't just splash, it crushed. Those billion-dollar ships were tossed like leaves in a storm, slammed into the buildings along the waterfront. The naval base, the pride of our defense, was erased in a single heartbeat. The hills around the city were stripped of their houses and their trees, leaving nothing but bare, brown earth. Jesus showed me that no weapon formed by man, no matter how powerful, could stand against the shaking of the creation when the Creator moves his hand. We moved inland to Las Vegas. The City of Lights was a black hole in the middle of the desert. Without the power from the dams, which had been cracked by the tremors in the earth, the city was nothing but a collection of glass and steel skeletons. I saw the people who had come there to escape their lives, now trapped in a reality they couldn't gamble their way out of. The fountains were dry, and the luxury hotels were becoming tombs of heat and dust. I saw people drinking water from the swimming pools, not knowing it was poisoned with chemicals and heat. The illusions were gone. The gold paint was peeling and the velvet was rotting. I saw the desperation of those who had lived for the moment, now finding that the moment had turned into an eternity of thirst. Jesus showed me that this city was a symbol of what the whole country had become, a place of shiny surfaces with no substance underneath, a place that traded its soul for a jackpot that was never going to be paid. Then he took me to Charlotte. I saw the massive banking towers, the centers of the nation's wealth. I watched as the computer systems flickered and went dark. The money that people thought was safe in their accounts simply vanished. It wasn't stolen, it just ceased to exist because the system that held it was gone. I saw the wealthy men in their fine suits standing on the sidewalks, looking at their phones with a look of pure horror. They were realizing that their entire lives were built on a dream that had ended. I watched as one of the tallest towers began to lean. The soil beneath it had been weakened by a hidden spring of water that had burst forth from the earth. The building fell slowly, crushing the smaller buildings around it, and a cloud of white dust filled the air. Jesus showed me that when the gold and silver fail, the people who worship them are left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a heart full of shadows. As we stood over the ruins of these cities, the air changed. It became heavy and thick, and I felt a new kind of dread, one that didn't come from the earth or the water. Jesus pointed toward the center of the broken nation. I saw a group of men and women gathered in a room that was powered by a separate, secret source of electricity. They were calm, almost smiling, as they looked at screens showing the destruction I had just witnessed. They weren't mourning, they were waiting. Jesus spoke to me, and his voice was like a bell in the middle of a storm. He told me that these leaders would use this chaos to bring in a new order. He showed me people in the streets, starving and covered in dust, begging for someone to help them. Then I saw the solution. I saw trucks arriving with food and clean water, but they weren't for everyone. To get to the front of the line, people had to walk through a gate. At that gate, they were asked to submit to a new system of identity. I saw a small device, something that used light to scan the skin of the hand and the face. I saw a young mother with a crying baby. She looked at the food and then at the scanner. She was terrified, but her hunger and the screams of her child were louder than her fear. She stepped forward and let the light touch her. In that moment, I saw a darkness settle over her soul, a thin, gray veil that separated her from the light of God. It wasn't just a mark on her skin, it was a surrender of her will. Jesus told me that this system was the ultimate yoke. It was designed to look like mercy, but it was the final prison. He told me that once a person took this mark into their body, they were tying themselves to the one who rules the darkness, and their ears would become deaf to the voice of the Spirit. I saw this happening all over the country. In Denver, in Atlanta, in the ruins of Philadelphia. People were lining up, traded their freedom and their eternal lives for a loaf of bread and a bottle of water. The leaders were calling it a system of peace and security, but Jesus called it the covenant with death. He showed me that the technology was already in place, hidden inside the things we use every day, just waiting for the moment when the world would be broken enough to accept it. He told me that the hunger would be the greatest test. He said that many who called themselves by his name would fail this test because they had not learned to trust him for their daily bread while things were still good. He let me feel the weight of that choice. It was a choice between a temporary life and an eternal one. I saw some people who refused. They were driven out of the lines. They were mocked and called crazy. They retreated into the woods and the mountains, carrying nothing but their Bibles and their faith. They were hungry and they were cold, but their souls were shining like diamonds in the dark. I saw Jesus standing with them in the shadows, invisible to the world, but more real than the trees around them. He was providing for them in ways that defied logic, a hidden spring of water, a patch of berries that shouldn't have been there, a feeling of warmth in the middle of a freezing night. Jesus looked at me and said, "The world will offer them a life that is a lie. I offer them a death that leads to life. Tell them to choose the narrow path, for the wide gate leads to the void." I understood then that the disasters were not just punishments. They were a shaking to see what was real and what was false. The systems of man were being stripped away so that the heart of every person would be forced to reveal who it truly served. My name is Christopher Coons. I am 33 years old and a sergeant first class in the Army Rangers. For over a decade, I believed only in the strength of my own hands and the steel of my weapon. I was not a religious man. I was a soldier who relied on logic and training, drifting far from the faith of my childhood to focus on being the most effective warrior I could be. On April 2nd, 2026, my life as I knew it ended during a night training maneuver at Fort Hunter Liggett. Our tactical vehicle hit a hidden ravine at high speed, flipping 3 times before the fuel system ignited. I was pinned in the wreckage, the heat searing my skin and the smoke filling my lungs. My heart stopped beating, and my breath ceased. The medical report later confirmed I was dead for 14 minutes. While the medics worked to pull my charred body from the steel, I was no longer on that field in California. I was suddenly standing in a place of immense living light. It was a farm, but it felt like the heartbeat of the world. The soil was dark and fertile beyond anything on earth, and the crops were massive, heavy with golden grain that swayed in a breeze I could feel against my face. But a heavy dread hung over the beauty. At the edges of the fields, I saw 4 giant bulls, as tall as houses. 3 of them were painted with the colors of foreign powers, red, gold, and deep green. They began to tear into the crops with a greedy, violent hunger, stomping the harvest into the mud. Then I saw the 4th bull, painted with the stars and stripes of the United States. It was the largest of all, but it was not fighting back. It began to shudder from within, its legs buckling until it crashed into the dirt, dead from its own internal rot. The other bulls immediately moved in to trample its remains. That was the moment I turned and saw him. I saw Jesus standing in the light, and I fell to my face because my legs simply would not hold me. It wasn't like seeing a person. It was like being in the presence of everything that is true and pure. I felt an overwhelming wave of love that made me weep for every moment I had ignored him, but I also felt his profound sadness. His eyes were like fire, yet they held a kindness that broke me. He reached out and touched my shoulder, and his thoughts entered my mind as clearly as if he were shouting. He told me that he was showing me these things because the time of the harvest was here, and I was being sent back as a messenger to warn those who would listen. He turned me once more toward the map of the world, and I saw the great city of Chicago. It was the middle of a brutal, airless summer. The heat was so thick it felt like walking through water. I saw the massive skyline reflecting a sun that seemed to be burning with a strange white anger. Then I felt a pulse in the air, a silent snap of energy. The entire power grid of the city didn't just fail, it vanished. I saw the millions of people in the high-rise apartments, trapped in rooms that were becoming ovens. The elevators stopped. The water pumps that sent life to the upper floors went silent. I saw the desperation in their eyes as they looked out over a city that had become a desert of glass and steel. Without the cooling systems, the very air in the streets became toxic with heat and exhaust. I saw thousands of people trying to reach the lake, but the roads were blocked by stalled buses and cars that had simply died in the middle of the lanes. There was no way to call for help, no way to know if anyone else was even alive. Jesus showed me that the complexity of the city was its own trap. The more people relied on the switch on the wall and the water from the tap, the more helpless they were when those things were taken away. Then he moved my vision to the northwest, to Seattle. I saw the Space Needle standing against a gray sky, but the ground beneath the city was not solid. I saw the tectonic plates deep underground, grinding against each other with a pressure that was screaming to be released. When it finally broke, it wasn't just a shake, it was a shift. The coastline dropped several feet in a single moment. I watched as the Puget Sound rushed inland, a dark wall of water that swallowed the piers and the markets. But then, I looked toward Mount Rainier. The mountain, which had been a beautiful backdrop for so long, began to breathe fire and ash. The heat from the volcano melted the glaciers in seconds, sending a massive wall of mud and rock, a lahar, down the river valleys. It met the incoming tide of the ocean, and the city was crushed between the fire of the mountain and the weight of the sea. I saw the people running toward the hills, only to find the hills themselves were sliding away. Jesus showed me that the things man considers beautiful and permanent are but dust when the earth begins to reclaim its own. From the fire and water of the north, we moved to the capital, Washington, D.C. I saw the white monuments, the symbols of the laws, and the history I had fought for, but they looked like ghosts. I saw the stones of the Great Dome beginning to crack. It wasn't just an earthquake. It was as if the very spirit of the place was crumbling. I saw the leaders in their hidden bunkers, staring at screens that showed nothing but static. They were trying to issue orders to an army that was no longer listening, to a people who were already gone. I saw the beautiful parks and the grand avenues filled with a thick gray fog that smelled of old paper and rot. The power was gone here too, and in the darkness, the statues of the founding fathers seemed to be weeping. Jesus let me feel the weight of the broken promises that had been made in those halls. He showed me that when a nation turns its back on the source of its life, the walls it built to protect itself will eventually become its own tomb. He then showed me the vastness of the heartland, the small towns and the farms that I had always thought of as the soul of the country. I saw the crops withering, not just from heat, but from a blight that seemed to come out of the air itself. I saw farmers standing in their fields, holding the dried husks of corn, their faces lined with a grief that words cannot touch. They had worked the land for generations, but the land was no longer answering them. I saw the small town stores with empty shelves and the churches where the doors had been kicked in by people looking for something to eat. But among them, I saw families who had gathered in their living rooms, reading the Bible by candlelight, their faces peaceful even as the world outside went mad. They had prepared, they had stored away what they could, and they were sharing it with their neighbors. I saw Jesus standing in the corners of those rooms, a silent guardian over those who had not forgotten his name. He then pulled me back to the vision of the 4 bulls in the farm. He pointed to the bull that represented our nation lying dead in the dirt. He showed me that the internal rot was a disease of the spirit, a love of money, a pride that knew no bounds, and a turning away from the light of truth. He showed me that the 3 foreign bulls were now standing over the carcass, their horns red with the blood of our land. They were dividing the territory, carving up the states like pieces of a prize. I saw foreign soldiers walking through the streets of our broken cities, not as liberators, but as scavengers. They were taking the resources that were left, the fuel and the grain, and sending them back to their own lands. The people who were left were being treated as nothing, a burden to be managed or removed. Jesus then turned my gaze toward the 5 places of refuge he had mentioned. He showed me Idaho first. I saw the rugged mountains and the deep forests. It looked harsh, but I saw people there who were strong. They were building small cabins and planting gardens in the clearings. They had no electricity, but they had clean water from the mountain springs. I saw them gathering in the evenings to sing hymns, their voices echoing through the pines. There was a shield of light over those mountains that the darkness could not penetrate. Then he showed me West Virginia. I saw the rolling hills and the hidden hollows. I saw communities of people who had lived simply for a long time, and they were taking in those who had fled the chaos of the coast. They were teaching the city people how to survive, how to heal with herbs, and how to find food in the woods. The mountains there acted like a fortress, keeping the violence of the world at a distance. Next was Nebraska. I saw the wide, open plains. While the rest of the country's crops were failing, there were patches of green here that were being tended by the faithful. They were growing heirloom seeds, the kind that had been passed down from grandfathers. These plants were strong and survived the strange weather. I saw huge tables set out in the open air where hundreds of people sat down to eat together, sharing the harvest of the day. There was a peace there that felt like a dream. Then he showed me Maine. I saw the rocky coast and the cold, dark ocean. The people there were hardy and quiet. They were using small boats to fish, and they were gathering wood from the vast forests to keep their homes warm. They were far from the centers of power and the madness of the system. Finally, he showed me Arkansas. I saw the Ozarks, a land of ancient hills and deep caves. I saw people who had prepared hidden places of safety, stocked with everything needed to survive for years. They were a people of prayer, and the light of the Spirit was bright in those valleys. Jesus looked at me with a gaze that went through my entire being. He told me that these 5 states were not places of luxury, but places of testing and survival. He said that he would provide for his children in these refuges, but they must come with a humble heart. He warned me again about the system that was coming. He showed me the technology of the mark in more detail. It wasn't just a scan, it was a connection. Once the biometric link was made, the person's very thoughts and emotions were being monitored by the system. It was a complete theft of the soul. He told me to warn everyone I meet. Do not trust any leader who says that peace comes through a chip or a scan. Do not trust any system that trades your identity for a meal. He said that it is better to starve in the woods with him than to feast in the city with the world. He showed me how to prepare the people. He said they must get seeds, the real kind, the ones that produce seeds for the next year. He said they must learn the old ways of making fire and cleaning water. He told me that communication would be the greatest challenge. He said to find ways to talk that do not rely on the digital world, for that world would be the first thing the enemy would use to track and trap the faithful. But more than the physical tools, he emphasized the spirit. He said that a man with a full stomach but a dead soul would not survive what is coming. He told me to tell the people to read the word, to memorize it, so that when the books are taken away, the truth remains in their hearts. The visions began to fade into a soft, golden mist. I felt the presence of Jesus receding, but his words remained branded into my mind. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, the feeling of my ribs knitting together and the air rushing back into my lungs. I felt the weight of the world, the gravity of my broken body, and the smell of the hospital room. I was back. He commanded me to tell people to prepare immediately. He said to gather seeds that can be planted year after year, to find ways to clean water that do not require electricity, and to move away from the dense cities now. But above all, he said to prepare the heart. He told me that faith in him is the only thing that will stand when the ground is shaking. He said the time for choosing is not tomorrow, but today. The light began to pull away, and I felt the crushing weight of my broken body once more. I woke up in the hospital in agony, but my mind was clear. Today is April 7, 2026. I am a soldier, and I have been given my final orders from the highest commander there is. The events are in motion. The earth is ready to tremble. My name is Christopher Coons, and I am telling you the truth because I have seen what is coming. Prepare your souls.